There are many teachings in the Buddha Dharma which list things, very many sayings that are worthwhile reflecting upon. One of these lists are the 8 worldly conditions. There's some nods here, so people know what these 8 worldly conditions are. You're familiar with them, but what do you do about them? How can you implement them, these teachings? So these 8 worldly conditions, also known as the 8 worldly winds, because they tend to send us from one place to the other. These 8 worldly conditions are 4 pairs. First, there is gain. We gain things and happy about that. And on the other hand, there's loss. Then people praise us. We're happy for that. But then they blame us. Not so good, huh? Then there's liking. We like things. And dislike things. So you can see they're pairs. There's always a flip side, positive or negative. And then there's happiness, okay? And on the other side there is unhappiness. So these are the 8 worldly conditions, or 4 pairs. What we can read into this teaching is that the mind itself tends to polarize. We like, dislike, gain and loss. So we almost like the mind tends to be bipolar. It may not be a clinical condition, but certainly the mind is going from one to the other, one extreme to the other. So what is that telling us? And what is it pointing to in the teachings? We can say that the Buddha's path is essentially one of balance, that the outcome would be balance. In fact, in the 7 factors of enlightenment, starting from mindfulness, presence, then the maturity factor in this practice of mindfulness is equanimity, balance of mind, equipoise. So if we may know about these 8 worldly conditions, but to maintain the balance, we need to practice mindful presence. Now, we know that currently mindfulness has become the buzzword. Many people are in the corporate world, even in schools, but largely in the therapies. It's now being used as a healing tool. And this is very good, because the Buddha, when he said he had about mindfulness, about the practice of mindfulness, he had rediscovered an ancient path. So we can understand from that it's a universal practice. And now that in the modern world, people are picking up this practice of mindfulness as a healing tool, as a therapeutic tool. Okay, but mindfulness too, apart from its healing side, is also transformational. It is not simply just a practice to heal the mind. From a Buddhist perspective, as the Buddha gave out, it brings transformation of consciousness. So this quality of balance, where the mind tends to polarize, is a practice of maintaining the middle way. So in the instructions the Buddha gave, in the 4 establishments of this mindfulness practice, first we bring our attention to establish ourselves in the body, to maintain, to ground ourselves in the body. That is the starting point of the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, that you bring your attention into the body, investigating its nature. Then we go in the second sphere of attention, you might call it, mindfulness based on monitoring one's feelings, their body sensations as feelings, but there's also mental feelings. So to mature your practice, to maintain equanimity, then you must be monitoring feelings. We like and dislike. So liking is pleasant feeling, disliking brings up unpleasant feeling. So we tend to be constantly going from one to the other. Whereas to maintain the balance of practice is to have the maturity of noticing feelings without reacting, without making any judgment, being okay about feelings as they come and go, not to be interfering with them, not to be caught up, but they allow them to be elaborated into stories. So feeling is part of the mindfulness practice, to be monitoring, to be noting one's feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And feelings can be found every time one sees, hears, smells, tastes, and touches. The five senses and within the mind itself. So there are mental feelings that we should be aware of. With noticing feelings, that will help the mind to maintain its equilibrium. To have non-reactive awareness. The mind tends to be impulsive, to be reactive. So if we can maintain this present moment awareness, we can develop balance, we can notice feelings before they get caught up in, developed into emotions. So we know feelings as feelings and we'll leave it at that. So we're not becoming, the Buddha said there's five things we cling to, or identify with. Another list: the body, feelings, perception, the mental content, and the consciousness. These are the five things we cling to. There's eight worldly winds, and there's five qualities that we identify with. So noticing feelings is primary to the practice of mindfulness. Feelings. Then there is the knowing, the consciousness. Consciousness always has an associated mind state. Happy, sad, elated, depressed. So again, we've got these opposites. But having presence of mind, maintaining moment-to-moment awareness of what is happening in the moment, then we can maintain more balance in our life, not being caught up in just pure reaction or impulsive sort of actions. So mindfulness is the key to the practice to develop this equanimity, homeostatic balance in the body and mind. So there's body, in the four establishments of mindfulness, there's body, feelings, the consciousness, the knowing of something, / mind states, and the mental content. So if we are observing these without reaction, without judgments, then we will find that we can maintain more equanimity. So it's a training. It's not sufficient that you just know about these 8 worldly conditions or these teachings. It's whether or not you implement them, whether you actualize them. That is, people get quite happy to study the teachings and have some intellectual understanding of it, but few people are actually inclined to be practical and implement them, especially as regards one's daily life, within one's daily routine. So the mind has this tendency to polarize. It is the mindfulness practice that creates the balance, creates the awareness that eventually we are less impulsive, and as we practice mindfulness, it becomes more that it's deconditioning us. It is freeing us from our conditioning. It's freeing us essentially from the impurities of the mind. There's a story about the Buddha before he was enlightened. He was a monk, a mendicant monk, who would go for alms round. And just before he was enlightened, he was washing his bowl in the nearby river, and he lost hold of it, and according to the story, it went against the stream. It went against the current. So this, people read that as a miracle. This was an auspicious sign that he would then be enlightened as an endeavour. But you could read this as just a metaphor. That actually the practice of mindfulness, it's mindfulness that leads to insight, is actually going against the current. And to go, while you go with the stream, everything's okay, everything seems fine. But when you go against the stream in this practice of mindfulness, you create white water, you can create turbulence. So you'll find in Buddhist countries even, mindfulness is not, until recent years, is not, even within the ordained Sangha, is not practiced so much. People tend to practice this other form of meditation called, based on concentration, what we call samatha, which induces a state of calm. It's a feel-good state, right? Whereas mindfulness is actually uncovering hidden disturbances, hidden impurities in the mind. So you'll find even in Theravada countries, in the early tradition, mindfulness has largely been lost. It was reintroduced after the Second World War by Mahasi Sayadaw of Burma, essentially. And that's why a lot of people now who are practicing Vipassana, it's called, Vipassana means insight, so we can say mindfulness is the practice and the insight is the outcome. So now we're finding that mindfulness is being used in a therapeutic, healing way in the West more and more, but we also need not to lose the sight of the Buddha's deeper teaching that to practice mindfulness intensively will bring transformation of consciousness. It will bring balance of mind. Certainly there's healing there, but healing is essentially more, from a Buddhist perspective, more of a byproduct. Psychological difficulties and traumas can be overcome. But deeper than that, we can bring, whether we have scars, past traumas, we can overcome those and be equanimous about them, not constantly working through previous traumas and difficulties. We can go beyond that and maintain balance of mind, equanimity. That's the teaching the Buddha gave. We look at one of the eight worldly winds, happiness and happiness. In Western culture now, in Western meditation culture and Buddhism in general, there's a trend going that's taking the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha gave in the first teachings, the Four Noble Truths, you would know, the fact of unsatisfactoriness, of suffering. Mm-hmm. And the cause of that is one's hankering and desire. And the Buddha then says it can be ended. And how to end it would be through the practice of the Eightfold Path. So that's familiar to most Buddhists, these Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. But in Western Buddhism now, there are teachers going around saying that these are the Four Noble Truths of happiness. Well, okay. I mean, you can understand that people want to popularise the Buddha's teachings, but just to say that the practice towards happiness doesn't deal with the underlying problem of that life is in fact can be unsatisfactory, that there is suffering. So, okay, we can go along with the American Constitution and say that life is about the pursuit of happiness, but if you have happiness, as we know in the eight worldly conditions, you get the flip side. The opposite is unhappiness. So we're not seeking happiness. We're seeking understanding of our own mind and to bring transformation through the practice of the mindfulness or Vipassana meditation. So the problem is, though, that people think, especially in the early days, Buddhism was, in the early tradition, was presented more as all about suffering. Certainly we accept the fact of suffering and we see the cause of it, and that's the practice of mindfulness is to free us from the cause of suffering, which is the hankering and grasping and attachments of the mind, certainly. But the Buddha wasn't just saying it was all about suffering and that was it. And what the Buddha is saying, that suffering is unnecessary. There's a fact of it, the cause of it. He's saying you can be free of it, and this is the way to be free of the Eightfold Path. And in the Eightfold Path, while there's an ethical base, essentially the meditation practice is based around samasati, which translates as right mindfulness. Mm-hmm. So we can say that present the teaching not as to achieve happiness, but to understand that that suffering is unnecessary if you practice. If you practice, you will see that you have the intelligence and the insight to see one's own body and mind phenomena as it really is, not what you assume it might be, not be just lost in your own upbringing and conditioning. You can be free of that. So it's all a matter of whether you can maintain equanimity. All Buddhist practice leads to equanimity, equipoise. So instead of being polarizing, going from one extreme to the other, we can maintain the middle way, the way of through practice. It's not just whether you intellectually know all these teachings, but what the Buddha is actually saying through the Four Noble Truths, the outcome is that you can be free of suffering if you practice. Have an ethical base and practice mindfulness. The meditation skill set you find in the Eightfold Path is application, applying oneself to the practice of what? Samasati, to mindfulness. And then the third factor is intensify, deepen the practice that will bring healing and transformation. Mm-hmm. So you're not then caught in this polarization. The mind is not while it will naturally polarize, go from one extreme to the other, it can maintain the middle path of the Buddha, the middle way, and maintain balance, even in busy situations. There's a story the Buddha told of how to practice mindfulness. He illustrated by having a person balancing a pot of oil filled to the brim on his head as he walked through the marketplace. It wasn't in a monastery, it wasn't in a meditation hall. This person is balancing this pot of oil full to the brim on his head. Now, as you know, if you fill anything to the brim, you have to maintain the balance. It will spill or it will spill. So as this person went through the marketplace and within the crowd, he had to maintain the balance. That's essentially the practice. But also he needed to have that intensity. It's Vipassana practice, mindfulness, sati, that leads to insight. Vipassana needs to be intensified. It's not a casual, occasional practice. It doesn't bring, well, there are therapeutic benefits, I'll say to that, certainly. And it's good that the Western world is picking mindfulness up, but it's much more than that, it's deeper than that. To bring transformation, it needs to be intensified. You need to do, people are all different levels, certainly, but it needs that, some people, who are inclined to the practice more, to intensive practice that will bring transformation of consciousness. So this person, for some reason, it seems rather bizarre that you walk through the market with a bowl of oil on your head to balance it, but behind that person, through the crowd, a person walked behind this person with a sword. And if they spilt anything, off with their head. So it's a matter of life and death, really, this practice. If you don't do it, well, you just, by default, you'll suffer, for sure. You don't have to look for suffering. If you haven't got the right mind, haven't got the understanding, haven't done the training, an untrained person, because everything has phases, beginning, middle and end. We don't see the beginnings of things very well, and we're not inclined towards ends. So when we see the three phases of all phenomena, birth, life and death, everything's going to pass away, everything's going to change. It's not just climate change, it's everything's changing now, has done and always will do. So if we don't have that flexibility and ability to go with the flow without reaction, then we're going to suffer by default. And to suffer, if you are well aware of the Buddha's path, if you know the teachings and don't practice, then you'll suffer. It doesn't matter what you want to call yourself a Buddhist or not. If you don't practice mindfulness, which is the core Buddhist practice, then how can you be a Buddhist? How can you develop in the path? So the teaching is there. It's a matter of whether you implement it or not. So what we can say, that suffering, okay, is a fact. We can know the cause of it, the hankering in the mind, conditioning in the mind. We can say it's going to can end, and we can say through the practice of the Eightfold Path, essentially the mindfulness. So we say it's unnecessary. So if you don't mind me saying so, if you're suffering, why? Because you're stupid. It's stupid suffering. If you're a Buddhist or no Buddhist practice, if you're still suffering, well, it's stupid suffering, because the Buddha's saying it's not necessary. He always emphasised training. You must train yourself this way. So if you're not training, whatever level, and if you can't maintain some equanimity coming from knowing, especially one's feelings, without reacting, without judgment, then you can be slowly, gradually, it's a gradual path for sure. So you need to think about the long-term practice, long-term involvement, that working with the mind to maintain equanimity and not suffer. Why suffer?